Today on Possessed, we will be considering the storied history of the nuclear family as we know it. One of the most pervasive ideas is how families could or should work in the United States today. All of us were born into and raised by families. So the ways we were raised and formed and the shape of those families really do vary quite a bit. Some of us may have even been born into different families than the ones that we were raised by. But all of us have some experience with a family, whether positive or negative or a good mix of the two. And the ideas that we carry around with us about the way families should work, and indeed the way that human reproduction should work, are incredibly impactful and are not so often called into question. We'll be talking about parenting, education, care, the gender division of labor, and even sex and pregnancy. We're delighted to be joined by Jennifer Augustine and Allison Dunatchik, both sociologists here at the University of South Carolina. Thanks
Great to be here.
Yeah, good to be here. Thanks.
Before we get started, do me a favor and tell me a little bit about your work and how it relates to various ideas about how families do or ought to work in the United States. I'd like to go first.
Sure, I'll go first.
Sure.
So for the audience who's listening, I'm Jennifer. So my research focuses on the normative dimensions of social life, particularly normative aspects of work, parenting, and gender, in combination with structural dimensions of family life, specifically parents' occupations, so their positionality in the occupational hierarchy and the types of resources that their jobs afford, family structure and families' marital histories and trajectories, and parents' educational backgrounds in terms of both their degrees, but also their pathways through the educational system. And I'm particularly interested in how these normative dimensions of family life and structural dimensions of family life intersect in ways that contribute to gender and class-based inequality, both within families and between families.
I'm Allison. I study gender inequality, so I'm interested in why gender inequality in the labor market and families in the U.S. and other high-income countries continues to persist despite widespread advances in women's labor force participation and their educational attainment. So I'm interested in questions around why we still see such entrenched gender inequalities in economic outcomes and in the way that people spend their time. So in terms of how much time men and women spend on things like housework and childcare and other forms of unpaid work. And in trying to address these questions, my research focuses on people who are in nuclear families. I study straight couples and how couples decide to divide all of the types of work that sustain our lives, so paid work and unpaid work. And I'm interested in how these gender inequalities are reproduced within straight families and straight couples, and in some cases, in some contexts, how they're mitigated as well.
Wow. I'm excited to hear more about both of these things. This is amazing. Yeah, so I'm already getting a sense from even just this brief introduction to your work, the number of times that both of you use the word equality or inequality. This is really political. There's so much that's political about what you're already naming. One of the slogans of the feminists in the 70s was that the personal is political. I was kind of thinking we might say that the family is political. So I'd be interested in how politics plays a role in what you do, how you see ideas about what the family ought to do, the kind of normative, regulating ideal about how the family ought to work. How does that play in your work, and how does it affect politics at a higher level? So what do you see?
So I would say that I'm somewhat careful in my work about making assertions around how families ought to work. I try to let the empiric speak for itself, and when I'm making sort of an evaluative assessment that kind of is along the axis of good and bad, I try to connect it to some kind of objective, indisputable dimension of well-being. So maybe I might look at parenting time and how it's unequal between mothers and fathers, but connect it to mothers and fathers' psychological health or their self-reports of their happiness. Or I might look at different kind of styles of parenting, and instead of asserting that middle-class parenting is superior, making a more objective assertion that connects different parenting behaviors with different child outcomes that we can all agree higher is typically better. So higher levels of academic achievement is something that we could all kind of universally agree that as a society we should support. So that's the way that I think about that question. I mean, I do think about how politics comes into play in different ways. So one thing that I consider is how my research might have implications for different groups in ways that have become politicized.
Interesting.
So, for example, I've done research on same-sex families and children's well-being. During the fight for marriage equality, that was a highly politicized issue, and a lot of a portion of the argument that was made before the courts was that these types of arraignments are deleterious to children. Yeah. So different groups submitted amicus briefs that, drew from the sociological and the psychological research on, the connection between children's experience in different sex families and their different developmental outcomes. And so I'm cognizant of how my research fits into that larger discourse when I do that type of research.
Sure.
Another area that I am very sensitive to is when I'm talking about racial differences in family life, because there are pronounced demographic differences, and there's a real risk when talking about them that they just reinforce some of these stereotypes, some of which are very ugly and pejorative. For example, stereotypes around single parenting and kind of welfare dependency. So those are the ways that I guess consider the political nature of my work.
Wow.
I think a lot about how politics and policies affect what happens within families that feel very personal choices, but are very much constrained by politics and policy. So I study how couples divide paid work, housework, childcare. These all feel like very personal decisions that are based on people's preferences and who's better at getting the kids to calm down and go to bed, and all these sorts of things that feel very individualized and very personal. But I think it's really important to, and what I try to center in my work is that the choices that are available to couples and to individuals are inherently shaped by politics and policy, right? So it's a political choice that new parents in the U.S. don't have access to paid leave. Political choice that parents don't have access to subsidized childcare, and that the U.S. government largely does not assist parents in finding high-quality, affordable childcare. And so while these sorts of decisions feel very much like, something that couples are deciding based on what they prefer to do or what they think is right to do, inherently policy or the lack of public policy oftentimes in the U.S. is really constraining the choice set that's available to couples and to individuals. And so some of what my work does is think about what choices couples make in different policy contexts. And it's no surprise that largely when couples have greater access to things like paid leave and childcare, they tend to make more egalitarian decisions around how to divide things than in contexts where they don't have those supports.
Wow, so I'm one of the areas of my interest as an ethicist is in all of, and it sounds like you guys are both speaking to this, in all the different ways that the situation that you find yourself in can so shape, constrain, and facilitate all sorts of the kinds of choices that you're going to make. And so certainly you're already helping us to see the ways that life in a family, putting down kids to bed, I mean, that's so real, can be, the way that that's divided can be shaped by, at like a major, pretty high policy level. Allison, would you tell us, so I'm just thinking, so this episode, we're going to be talking about the nuclear family and how the way that family kind of works over the last, let's say, 6 or 7 decades has been a product of a number of choices, of political choices, and some of which might be maybe more circumstantial than like that was the way it always should have been or something like that. I'm thinking now of like the story about the in the 70s when we almost had subsidized childcare.
Right.
Can you tell us that story? Is that something that you would be comfortable doing?
Oh, I don't think I know the
all
ins
the-
and outs of the
yeah.
details, but Jennifer, I don't know if you have a better.
No, not
Yeah.
beyond, the
What almost was.
institutionalization. And
Yeah.
right.
Yes.
And then we have early Head Start and Head
Yes.
Start,
Yes.
which
Yes.
is not universal, but it's federally funded.
Yes. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. As far as I remember it, a bill to subsidize childcare passed on both sides of Congress and was vetoed by Nixon on the back end of trying to cool relations with China.
Right.
One of the key functions of a family in a society is that they are socialization agents of their children.
Yes.
And a key period of children's development and socialization is this early child care period. So the argument is actually made for early child care and against early child care. So
Yeah.
in the context of what happened during the Nixon administration, they were arguing against early child care because one key function of families is to socialize children, and that responsibility would have been taken away from families.
Yeah.
But the argument in support of childcare is that in today's society, many families are constrained in the amount of time and resources they have to support that socialization function. And so a universal childcare program would be a sort of critical institution that could help address that gap.
to facilitate that next step.
Yeah. But then there's the gender side of all of this too, because if you
course.
have universal childcare, you're also sending the message that it's okay for moms to work. You can give up your responsibility for
Yeah.
being children's primary caregivers. The state
Yeah.
will now fill that
Do
role.
that. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Which seems like that's connected to the nuclear family stuff, right?
Yes.
Yes.
Because the worry is that if you pay for people to have daycare, then mom goes into the workforce, or mom doesn't have to be the main caregiver anymore. And then what happens to the traditional conception of a family where the mom is the primary caregiver, right?
Yeah. So
Well, and not only that, but in the absence of childcare, she also needs a partner, right?
Right.
So
right.
it's also right.
That
could be-
marriage, yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah, I'm just thinking what this conversation is reminding me of is that the nuclear family as it functions is, I mean, the kind of the nuclear part is really, it's not just, a little kind of atomic units, although that is a big part of the nuclear family. But also, the way that a nucleus works, it's not like an atom, is that there's like different parts playing different functions. And so something that's really important about the nuclear family as a regulating ideal is the gendered nature of care and how that's divvied up. Right?
Yeah.
Right.
And from a sociological perspective, it's also why many family researchers argue that the family is an institution. Now,
Yes,
there's a
yes,
healthy
an
debate
institution,
around
yes.
that, whether it's an institution or an institutional arena, or whether we should just abandon this idea entirely. But it does fulfill these functions that other social institutions don't, in a U.S. context at least. And in a modern context.
And that's just the fact of the matter, that the family does a lot for us,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
My guess is that, Allison, you could tell us a lot about the unpaid side of all of the work that the family does.
Yeah. I mean, I think in the U.S. and in many countries, so much responsibility is relegated to the family, right? In terms of providing care, especially for children, but also adults, older adults. And really, I think the responsibility for ensuring one's economic position and economic security in the world has also been relegated to the family. And so there's been a lot of really interesting sociological research, I think by, like Mary Ann Cooper in her book, Cut Adrift, which talks about how, across the economic spectrum, families really feel a lot of anxiety. Even really wealthy families feel a lot of anxiety about ensuring, the future economic prospects of their children. and their current economic prospects in sort of the context of economic insecurity. So there's so much that we just assume that families will do, because I think for a large part, the U.S. government has sort of taken their hands off and said this is your responsibility. And I think Jessica Calarco, another sociologist, has another great book about how that has created a lot of labor for women in particular, that women have sort of had to step in and fill a lot of roles that are traditionally filled in a social safety net, just because the U.S. is so reluctant to enact policies to do that.
As a parent of two 16-year-old girls, they're twins, and we're just starting to think about college. So I acutely feel this anxiety about the ability of my children to make it in the world. And I definitely feel that is something that falls on my family.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I have a really weird family, right? So I'm a gay man in a gay marriage, and I have two adopted girls. So I see kind of all of these issues you're talking about in the abstract being like very much dramatized in my life. Like, we are a non-nuclear family.
Yeah.
And so I'm just wondering, like, does the research say anything about me, the prospects for my children, or how they've been maybe affected of being raised in a non-nuclear family? Like, how is that? What are the consequences of that? Do you know from your research?
I love that Matt is like, I'm feeling the pinch.
Right.
As we're talking.
Yeah.
So this is actually, this directly connects to my research, because a lot of my early research focused on why parents' educational background was such a powerful predictor of kids' outcomes and their own social class reproduction, above and beyond their own income and financial resources. So education is actually a more salient predictor of parenting, kids' cognitive development, their grades. Certainly financial resources matter, but not to the same degree, or not in the same ways. So the real divide, not just in terms of looking at kids' outcomes, but looking in terms of your outcomes, is along education. So while you have a non-traditional family, you resemble much more the sort of traditional middle-class, well-educated family, because you are stably married, your kids are going to go to college, and so that is where the real divide is.
God willing.
So it's all good news, Matt.
Yeah. But, there's some ways that, yes, I see your education matters. I've got that. But there's some weird ways that my family kind of looks like a nuclear family if you just squint and you don't notice the genders. So my husband was a stay-at-home parent and a full-time parent. So I remember, which it kind of makes us stand out a little bit in South Carolina. So there was this, we had twin kids. When you have twins, it's like there's this whole other weird world of childcare that you're in. And so my husband, Michael, wanted to interact with other people who were going through the same thing so we could talk. So there's this group, this kind of like a support group that was called the Moms of Multiples. And then they would, they get together and they would do events and things like that. And so Michael was like, I'm like, well, you're not a mom. And he was like, yeah, but so he joined, and he was like the only man, and he got them to change their name.
What was the
And that's
name?
a problem for stay-at-dads too,
Yeah.
right? So it's not exclusive of a sexuality issue. It's a more broadly.
Yes.
Sure.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, we noticed a lot of that in parenting. Like there was always this expectation that the primary caregiver was a mom. Like all children's television programming revolves around mothers.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, to your point about nuclear families, I'm not sure that it's even a relevant term anymore because, like you said, your family resembles a nuclear family, and a lot of families resemble nuclear families, but actually very few families match the formal
That's right.
definition of a nuclear family, in which not only are parents married and stably married and they have children, but there's also a traditional gendered division of labor. The vast majority of moms in different sex married households are working. And so there are very few narrowly defined nuclear families anymore.
So I understand education is the big leg up, and then income matters a lot too. But what about this kind of feature of a traditional family that you can find sometimes in untraditional places?
Yeah, so the research on child development and family structure finds that the most important dimension is the stability of the family, less so than the structure of the family. So the sort of key confounding factor when you look at single parent families is that many of them have experienced some sort of family structure disruption and transition. And of course, they kind of have a prior disruption also increases the risk of a subsequent transition, right? Because if you get a divorce, then the likelihood that there will be another transition that follows via a new relationship increases. So at least from children's perspective, the most salient dimension is how stable the family arrangement is, and less so whether there are two parents versus one parent and whether those parents are married or not. Now, there's also a correlation between marriage and the stability of the relationship, but the stability is sort of the most important dimension.
This actually touches on something that I found really, maybe we'll do a little sharing, a little story time. I have a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old at the moment. And one of the things that I learned in the process of becoming a parent was the importance of not just the labor, the work, although that was a pretty new thing to me, but also the kind of contingency, the possibility that some labor might be necessary, or that someone needs to go get the kids because of any number of issues, right, that happen at school or at daycare. So on a regular basis, we have a babysitter that is like an on-call. We pay her just to be on call in case, because who knows? Now, this role is often played by grandparents, or but increasingly people move. We don't have extended family nearby, and so we get that help elsewhere. So it's the point I'm just trying to make is what's fascinating about this is that it's not just about care and providing care, although that is a big part of what families do. It's also to be there in case. The way this like kind of contingency of care is also necessary, and the stability stuff that you're just talking about now, Jennifer, is drawing my attention to that. That when a family structure, or even like if you're in between jobs, or when my hunch is, Allison, that you have some thoughts about this too. Even the kind of work that women tend to be in when you don't get your work schedule up to 2 weeks before you get it, right? Until just then.
Absolutely.
That kind of uncertainty is precisely the thing that makes things difficult for family providers.
I love the idea that you hire a babysitter to be like a grandparent. Like what we're looking for is like a grandparent for hire. There's these critical kinds of labor that are done by the grandparent, which is what you get from this sitter.
There's a company called, I can't remember what it's called. It's like nannies or nanas. Like the idea is it's grandparents for hire. Really. Is kind of the idea.
I mean, basically, you're outsourcing what sociologists would call emotional labor, right? So it's an invisible dimension of labor that women disproportionately take on compared to men. And in your case, it's the emotional labor of worrying about the potential for something to disrupt your schedule.
Sure, it's some emotional labor, but also like I can't leave my classroom, and go pick up the kids. That's what it's like. Who's going to be there in case someone has diarrhea?
Yeah.
Because it can't be me, right?
Yeah.
So it's not even just, I mean, this is kind of a structural thing. It's not even just the fact that parenting is a lot of work. It's that it's also
unpredictable.
The most unpredictable experience I have ever undergone in my entire life. So I, if it's okay to just bring it into the conversation, this is one of the reasons I think that there's some skepticism about the way that the nuclear family has functioned. And a case that I'm thinking of, an example of such skepticism comes from a recent piece from David Brooks. I think this was 2020 or 2021. It was right in the middle of COVID.
It was 2020.
And David Brooks, a relatively famous conservative commentator, published this piece in The Atlantic. Maybe I shouldn't consider him conservative. Yeah, I think he's kind of middling in terms of his political commitments.
In today's world.
Yeah, sure.
He used to be conservative.
Exactly. Well, although I think he's also shifted a little bit. But yeah, well, we don't need to talk about David Brooks too much. But he published this piece in The Atlantic called "The Nuclear Family Was a Mistake." Mm-hmm. I'm interested in what you guys thought of maybe that piece, but also the history that preceded that piece, the kinds of things that the strands that he's drawing on to make the argument that he does. That I think that was maybe kind of like the crux of skepticism about like the nuclear family performing this role. What do you guys think?
So I had read the article before, and I looked it up again last night, and I have an Atlantic subscription. So one thing I didn't realize about it until I pulled it up in the app is that he was actually responding to an article that was published prior to his by a sociologist named Brad Wilcox, who is a well-known conservative sociologist. And there's lots of hand-wringing in the media about the sort of so-called decline of the family that kind of focuses on what has happened and conjures up the image of the nuclear family when kind of describing the nature of this decline.
This is the thing we've lost.
Right, exactly. So Brooks is trying to respond to that by kind of playing into the counter discourse, which is that, well, the nuclear family never really existed in the way that we think it did. And to the extent that it did exist, it was sort of this historical blip. So when he says that, what does he call the article again? The nuclear family was a mistake. Basically, he's not saying that it was a mistake in terms of, like, it was a mistake for society necessarily, but rather the fact that the nuclear family ever emerged was this sort of error in history.
That just the stars aligned to even make this thing possible.
Right.
It's not like that. But I think what's so fascinating and why I wanted to talk about it a little bit in this podcast episode is that I think a lot of us think that this is the way things always were, right? I'm thinking of the Kuntz book, The Way We Never Were.
Right.
I think we imagine that, like apple pie and pettiskirts is the ideal, the way that family has always or should always function. And a big part of what he's doing is undermining the idea that this is the way that things have always been, that it really was highly contingent based on, a post-war economy, all sorts of different things. But I think he does want to call into question a little bit the assumptions that that's also the way it should be, because it would be so difficult to maintain those kinds of social circumstances that like support that kind of family, in which the family is really providing. That is the fundamental, like, economic provision of security.
Right.
Can I ask a dumb question? So what's nuclear family mean here? Is it just like a traditional family with traditional gender roles, or is it something more than that? Is it like one parent works and one stays at home? Like, what do we mean?
So I take Brooks and other criticisms of the nuclear family to be maybe even more broad than that, but I don't want to provide or to claim to provide an authoritative definition for what people mean when they say nuclear family. But I'm actually thinking even just the idea of having a family, occupying a single family household, and providing the care that's necessary for children to be raised. So I'm not sure how different your family is from the nuclear family. Although I think it's important to make to notice the important distinctions that I'm sure the two sociologists in the room would want to do that. But I think Brooks is even thinking precisely the kind of work that Mary Nickel does by having a grandparent for hire, right? I love you, Miss Lindsay. Like, we could not live without you. That that idea that this is like the reigning model in which that's how you get, contingencies taken care of, that's kind of the package of the nuclear family. Tell me, I don't know, what do you guys think?
I mean, I think his argument is that family form is incredibly fragile and it works in a context of great economic prosperity. There are also some other social parts that are keeping it together that he kind of leaves out, that like women were not able to work and support themselves, and this all relied a lot on women's labor in the first place. And I think I agree with the element of his argument where he says, for contemporary families who are, socioeconomically advantaged, they can make it work by outsourcing all of these sorts of things. Yes. They can create their support networks by essentially buying their support networks, which I can understand that in my own life as well. And for people who don't have access to those resources, it's really difficult to maintain, and has been a disaster for those families. And I think I agree. I agree with that. That there's substantial inequality in the ability to maintain that kind of family. And fulfill all those roles that we relegate to the family.
I think part of the problem with Brooks's argument, though, is he's not critical of what those things are. And so it's ambiguous whether he is saying the chicken came before the egg or the egg before the chicken. And in a lot of places in the article, it reads as though he is arguing that the sort of breakdown in the nuclear family is actually the cause of these various social ills that he talks about, like depression, the opioid, epidemic, things of that nature.
Yeah.
And he doesn't actually talk about sort of the structural factors or the precipitating factors that kind of lead people down those different roads. Yeah. So I think that's one challenge, is trying to understand what exactly he is arguing for. Mm-hmm. But I also think he commits the same fallacy that he is critiquing, which is that it's just in an earlier period of time where he romanticizes this idea of extended families that also never really existed the way that he characterizes it.
Interesting.
So, he starts with this vignette about this movie called Avalon, but that type of three-generational family was also sort of a historical blip, because for centuries up until this demographic transition and even into, I guess the early 21st century, grandparents died early. And so there was very little co-survivorship between grandparent generations and grandchild generations. So the likelihood that a child knew, one of their grandparents throughout their entire childhood was very low, just based on sheer demographic factors and kind of lifespan. But grandparents also didn't have the type of relationship with kids that they do today. So this notion of the sort of modern grandparent, it can't be projected onto grandparents of 50, 60 years ago. There's research by a sociologist named Frank Furstenberg who looks at, and I think he collaborated with another sociologist named Andy Cherlin on this project, about modern grandparenting and how this sort of so-called bonds of sentiment between grandparents and grandchildren are a modern phenomenon that are in part supported by important policy and structural changes. So, up until the Social Security Act, poverty rates amongst the elderly were the highest amongst all different age groups. So grandparents didn't have the resources to be involved with their children. Right, exactly.
Or to live anywhere else, I don't know. Like, it's just, yeah. I think one thing that I think Brooks sort of decries is the increase in people over the age of 65 living on their own. But that could be seen as a success as well, that they can afford to live on their own. And by contemporary standards, 65 is not that old, right? Many people still work
too, so they're
at
more
the age of
functional
65.
and live independently as well, which they couldn't do before.
Right, exactly.
I was just going to say, okay, but can I ask a question about that?
Okay.
Because so my research is, in at least in part, on pregnancy and the kind of metaphysics and ethics related to pregnancy. And I've been just highly enamored of the evolutionary biologist, evolutionary psychologist, Sarah Hrdy's work on like how co-parenting, just the idea of collaborative parenting is one of the reasons that humans ended up being humans. The way that we got to the way that we are.
Yeah, the social demands.
That there are no other advanced primates who have who let other people care for their kids. Like chimpanzees are like contact with their mom constantly for the first 6 months, and like they don't get to touch anyone else, right? We are like, here's my baby, so I've got to go chill out for a second. I mean, of course, that wasn't happening. A million years ago, people weren't saying that, but like that the fact of our collaborative parenting really facilitated some of the social inclinations that infants have, that we have throughout our lives. So I do wonder if maybe part of the concern are these kind of bounded. I mean, I think that's what the real nuclear part is, the bounded family. And not just bounded geographically, although that, but also bounded in terms of responsibility. You guys take care of you guys take care of those kids. You guys take, like, when I go to church, and there's this kind of like oftentimes after church, well, like the kids will just like play, and I have very strong relationships with the other people who go to the church. So we don't like parent each other's kids, so we do a good bit of like, engaging with one of those kids and reminding, them don't do that, and that sort of thing. And there's ways in which at the beginning that kind of felt very taboo, like, I don't know if I'm allowed to do this. And I really had to enter into a deeper relationship to make that possible. And my sense is that one of the things that Brooks and then other critics of the nuclear family are trying to push for is like, why don't we do family a little bit more like that all the time? Why don't we have more collaborative participation in rearing of children?
It takes a village, Mary.
Yeah, exactly. The whole
it takes
a
a village.
I mean, because I do think sometimes we feel like I can't lean on my village. I'm not supposed to do that.
Yeah.
And the flip side is there are times when I don't want a village.
Of course.
When I get annoyed by the village, like that was one of the things that surprised me about raising kids was, and this might be a feature of being gay dads. I'm serious, because of how many women see the gay dads and are like, oh no, there is some essential child rearing element that is being missed here. And it is my job to come in and intervene and tell them how they're supposed to do it. So there was a lot of villaging happening.
Yeah.
Well, that, you just, congratulations, Matt, because you have thereby been inducted to the like mutual mom policing that is just very rife. So you're an honorary member. Well,
nice.
Welcome to the club.
So it wasn't just me.
Like,
moms do it to each other.
Oh, my sense is that there's a lot of like, this is the way that things should be. I mean, I do think that we have senses of family norms that we really do impose upon one another. Yeah, for better or worse.
And it can be for better, and it can be for worse.
Yeah. Okay, so I mean, we would be remiss if we don't say anything about the proposal that's been called family abolition. And that's the most radical version of this. That, like, village all the way down, right? Like, we should go collaborative parenting as far as we possibly could, right? So some people propose to go way farther than someone like Brooks's critique, and they want to argue that it's not just like the nuclear family, but like families are the problem. And so some folks who have been in this camp are Sophie Lewis and Enyi O'Brien, who suggest that in order to achieve the kind of equality that you guys are writing about, what we need, the thing that's necessary, is the elimination of the family as such. So Sophie Lewis wrote a book called Full Surrogacy Now a number of years ago, in which she says, we should think about pregnancy as essential labor. Let me just say, like, I say that in my own work. I think we should think about pregnancy as essential as essential labor. There's actually a book about pregnancy that's called Essential Labor.
Okay.
But Lewis adds, what we should do is, like, actually anyone who's pregnant should think of themselves as a surrogate for the babies of society, and to kind of maintain a particular kind of distance between themselves and the fetuses that they carry. Okay, so is there any legitimacy to some of these criticisms? Like, what do you guys see as like legitimate concerns? And then what do you think they're missing?
I mean, I feel like I'm only familiar with the sort of broad strokes of this,
Sure.
This family abolition movement, and I mean, I agree with the premise that accidents of birth are hugely consequential to children's life chances. Families are, hugely varied in their access to resources, both material resources and in terms of, readiness, ability to parent. Children have no control over what families they're born into, and it produces all sorts of inequalities that are ultimately unjust. The solution to that, I think maybe I find it a harder sell for me because I have such a hard time imagining what an alternative is or envisioning what the alternative is and how we get there when we as a society can't even collectively agree that something like student lunch debt among elementary schoolers shouldn't exist, or let alone that child poverty shouldn't exist. And maybe that's, we can't agree on that because we for so long have relegated the responsibility for child welfare to the family. And so we just assume that those are the problems of the family and we don't need to take responsibility. But I struggle to understand how we could get from the current moment to a society where everybody does assume responsibility for the care of children and care of each other as well. I don't know how we get there. I'm intrigued, but I don't know.
One of my biggest questions is just, I don't know if people recognize how hard care is.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it's such a nice sounding word, right? But it is so difficult to provide care for young and elderly, right?
Right.
It is onerous work that, I don't know that's built in. I didn't mean to cut you off.
Oh, no, you didn't. I was just chomping at the bit over here because I have a lot of different critiques of this argument. I have kind of a broader critique, which is related to Matt's point about the village, because we haven't kind of asked whether is the problem the family or the village, right? Like, what has happened to the village when parents and non-parents alike are working more hours than they had before? They're patching together jobs because of changes in the nature of the labor market. It's really difficult to maintain the village. So that also makes me really question this family abolition movement, because I don't think the sort of alternative structures exist that would provide more optimal support for individuals. Yeah. So that's kind of my broader take on that issue. Specifically, I think that it's ignoring a lot of really important things. So, for example, our built environment is created in such a way that fits families. How would you reconstruct where we live to support these sort of broader family arrangements in a society in which we already have extreme housing problems? It would be like trading one problem for another. So that's one take.
I'll just say what they'll say. I'm not saying that this is a view that I would share, but a big part of the movement is for communal kitchens. Mm-hmm. That we have. I mean, the kinds of zoning laws that we have that require single family homes
for
is
sure
a big part of the problem.
Yes.
Right.
So what we need to have, this is what they're going to say, is more buildings that are all sorts of mixed use, that house many families, and that even not just kind of on a geographic level, but even on an architectural level, that should not be within the building so bounded within between families. Whether or not that you find that exciting, because I think one of the concerns that I have is if I ask my students what is really getting their goat that day, it's their stinking roommates that won't clean their dishes. And so I think, okay, and you're going to scale that up to 40 families or something like that sharing kitchens. That gives me a lot of anxiety. But maybe that's because we don't live together well enough. I don't know. What do you think?
I mean, I find it exciting, but I find it highly impractical. So there's a sociologist named Matthew Desmond, and he was here speaking at USC a couple months ago, and he argues vehemently that we need to change zoning laws, and we need to develop a social movement around that. But he also makes the very important point that you never see people so galvanized until they have an apartment complex being built down the street from them. So and Matt knows this because he was involved in local politics, right? Typically, your city council meetings are quite snoozy until there's a zoning issue. Then everybody's coming out of the woodwork. Right. So it seems like an impractical solution. Like, let's focus on the areas where maybe there is more potential for large-scale change. That's my approach to that particular issue.
But I guess maybe one of the reasons people are so up in arms about zoning changes is because they're worried about property prices, which is just an inherent function of families to inherit property and perpetuate inequalities, economic inequalities. So, I mean, you just would really have to reimagine. It's not, you don't just abolish family. You'd have to abolish capitalism. You'd have to abolish property. You'd have to abolish everything else. I can't see any other way of making it work.
I completely agree on all these points about how unworkable and impractical it would be to eliminate the family. But one of the things that's interesting about this movement is it's kind of a thought experiment. Like, what would the world be like if there were no families? In what ways would it be a better world, right? And that's a way of framing the question, what is the value of a family? Like, what is the value that it brings? And so even though I think this proposal is kind of crazy, and I'm sure they realize at some level it's crazy too, it inspires like a really interesting question. One of the oppositions that I have to that idea is not about the unfeasibility of the alternatives, but about people's freedom and their rights. Like, the freedom to be able to have a child if you want, and to determine how you're going to raise that child your own. This is a fundamental, powerful freedom and right that people feel very entitled to.
And rightly so.
Well, that's the question, right? Because if we would be better off without the family, you're saying that the public good that you would get from this would outweigh the personal freedom that people have to have the child on their terms and then decide how that child is going to be raised on their own, right?
Folks in reproductive justice, activists in reproductive justice will talk about three rights: the right to have a child, the right not to have a child, and the right to raise a child in a healthy and safe environment. And those thinking about those things as rights is certainly would be difficult to accomplish in a world in which, you don't.
Your child belongs to the village, right?
That's right.
It doesn't belong to you anymore. It belongs to the village.
So that was one of my other critiques, right? So we are experiencing historically low fertility rates. We're, potentially on the verge of a population/economic crisis.
Oh, no, potentially about it. Okay. We're on the verge.
How do you incentivize people to have children when you basically have taken away the one remaining value that children bring, which is the love and intimacy that you derive from that personal relationship? So I don't see how within this movement you would be, it seems like it is a it's working in the opposite direction of the sort of pronatalist movement to increase fertility and kind of reverse course on this population problem that we have, because parenting is very costly. All right, so if you're taking away the one reward, then what incentive do I have to give birth anymore?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really important consideration because, I don't, this is so cliche and annoying, but, it's really difficult to describe the kind of relationship that obtains between a parent and a child. I do think, what family abolitionists will say is knowing that you're not going to be bearing that cost alone is a major help. What is it? It's something like 40% of women these days are saying, I want to have more kids than I'm having. And the vast majority of those are saying it's because I can't afford it. So, I mean, if there is more support, then maybe that's part of the answer, right? But I don't know,
But they want to
In the
have those
total
kids
abolition,
because
yeah.
they're their kids, right? Those kids are going to take care of them when they're old.
Yeah.
Not the...
See, okay, let me tell you, I'm not trying to express any kind of special friendliness to the view, because I have significant criticisms, but I do think I am worried that the way, I mean, for any of us, the way that we'll be convinced that we'll be taken care of is by making sure we have children. That sounds pretty terrible. Like, I think that people should be able to know that they're going to be well taken care of in the later stages of their life, whether or not they had children. And part of the difficulty right now is you either have that care provided to you by your children or by someone who's paid. And I mean, I'm thinking of, what is it, Dirty Work or Dirty Jobs. There's a recent book that came out maybe 2 years ago about how difficult particular kinds of jobs are, that we overlook the exhaustion, the toll that they take on workers. It seems to me like caring for the elderly is one kind of dirty job that we just depend on lots of people to do this work. So it feels like there has to be some other kind of way. Either you have kids who will take care of you, or you know that you're going to be, you expect to be taken care of by, like, someone who's paid a very, very low wage to make sure that you just kind of stay alive. That does sound pretty miserable. So I mean, I share your concerns that this feels a little bit difficult to imagine. The stuff that I find the most compelling is Kathy Weeks, who is also a family abolitionist, says, or maybe it's Sophie List, says something about, like, maybe part of the problem is I don't even have the desires. That, like, I've not been raised in a place where I can see a world like that and say, that is the right world, or something like that. That, like, maybe part of the problem is that we are so possessed by the nuclear family, by the idea that this is the way that family should work, that we can't move in any, direction beyond it. We couldn't have apartment buildings be built. We couldn't, I mean, I can't imagine what would happen if inheritances or taxes on inheritances grew, right? That they're already called the death tax to be very scary to people. Meanwhile, people like, Andrew Carnegie, like, insisted that his kids not get his whole fortune, right? Like, there's some value to moving in some kind of direction beyond some of this, I might guess. I don't know.
I mean, even though the nuclear family might have been a historical blip, two-parent married families have been around for a long time. And I think there's a reason why society has converged on that family form. And part of it is because it allows partners to make long-term investments that enable them to hedge against certain risks.
There's that uncertainty.
Right. And this is experienced, on a large scale in terms of who's going to care for you when you're older, but also in, like, mundane ways.
Who's going to pick up the kid when there's diarrhea?
Yeah, I always think about how I never learned to cook because I dislike cooking. And I made that choice not to invest in my cooking skills because I was betting on the fact that my relationship with my spouse, who likes cooking and is a decent cook, is going to endure. But that contributes to my happiness because now on a day-to-day basis, I don't have to do this activity that I abhor. So I think that there are these real benefits that are being taken for granted when we kind of talk about rejecting the nuclear family outright.
Yeah, I do think stability is really important in your life.
And I do think I agree with your point that I think we as a society need to actually value care and understand, the value behind care, unpaid care, and in terms of care that you can, care by, professionals. I think we need to actually monetarily value that care, and maybe that can provide an alternative if we lived in a society that actually valued care for what it is, where it doesn't have to be children. People can choose to live in other ways, and everybody fundamentally deserves to get the care that they deserve.
Can I tell you about a proposal that I've thought about for a good while along these lines? So you may know that in Germany and Israel, there's required enlistment.
Mm-hmm.
And if you don't enlist in Germany, you can do their version of like AmeriCorps in order to not have to enlist. Okay, I have thought that we should have something called Care Corps, where everyone has to do like 9 months of babysitting or like nannying or something. Now this is like more a thought experiment than an actual proposal. Let me tell you why. Okay, so in this idea, every single American has to have this experience, and what would benefit us because it would solve the care crisis. It would give people more of an insight into what having children is like, or caring is like, so that if they are thinking about whether or not to be a parent, they would make more informed decisions. It would also, I think, alleviate some of the gendered nature and the undervaluing of care, because people would say, oh my God, everyone would know. And they would say, oh my gosh, this is hard. We need to value care more highly. Okay, the reason that this will never happen is that I would never have some rando watch my kids.
Yeah.
And this is precisely
and
the
you'd be more
village
skeptical
thing.
if he was a male as
Exactly,
well.
Right.
exactly. So I think this is why I like this kind of thought experiment that's a little bit of a tongue-in-cheek proposal, is because I do think that it presses on exactly part of the issue, that you need trusting relationships with people in order to be able to like move through the world as a family. And also I do think though that it would be helpful to shift, when I look for babysitters in my classrooms,
Yeah.
it's usually women that come to me. It's almost never, ever, I don't think I've ever had a male student approach me with interest in watching my kids. Yeah. And I wish it were the case.
So some would argue that the problem is not the structure of families, but how we sort of conceptualize what marital partners do within families. So there's this kind of line of theory in sociology that argues that marriage is a greedy institution. So the reason that the village has broken down is because modern love-based marriage requires kind of our constant attention and constant care, and we have to be sort of singularly focused on maintaining this intimacy with our partners, which requires we go to, romantic dinners, just the two of us on Saturday night instead of hanging out with friends. And so an alternative is not to abolish families, but maybe like dial back the love a little bit. Do you know what I mean? Like your partner doesn't have to be the center of your universe. So if we reconceptualize what it means to have a long-term partner and how we think about that person, it might create space for us to invest in other relationships.
Sounds like another episode that we need on the history of romantic love and marriage.
Absolutely.
Okay, so nuclear family. I think I'm hearing no exorcism from Jennifer.
No, that's throwing the baby out with the bathwater.
Yeah. Okay. What do you guys think?
Yeah, I think I agree. I think there are many aspects of it we could get rid of. I think we could get rid of sort of patriarchal gender roles.
Yes.
I think the focus on stability and insulating people from economic risk can certainly, I think that would improve things a lot. And just an investment in care as a society more broadly.
Yeah, so maybe the nuclear family, not as such, but as it exists right now, in this idea that, okay, family, we're going to ask a lot of you.
Yeah. That's just unrealistic.
Yeah.
I mean, we could also work towards reducing stigmas against people who choose not to form traditional families. Singleness is on the rise, but it's still very hard to be single in certain spaces. So that is another potential pathway. And then from a policy perspective, we haven't really thought about ways that we can kind of distribute. We think about the distribution of resources in terms of units, and families and households are one of those units, which restricts access by single people or people in these more non-traditional arrangements from accessing certain government resources. Yeah. So that would be another area that you could tackle, I think, somewhat practically.
Yeah. Focusing on the individual rather than the unit. Yeah.
Guys, thank you so much for your insights, your expertise. This is so insightful and so helpful. It does feel like there are some things that maybe are worth exercising, like our idea that moms should be the ones to do all sorts of different caregiving. And yet I'm hearing that there's some important things about the family as it exists that are worth maintaining. So what a helpful contribution to our podcast about thinking about these ideas that we carry around with us. This certainly was a delight. Thank you so much for being here.
Thanks so much for having us.
Possessed is made possible by a generous grant from the University of South Carolina Humanities Collaborative.